Hello everybody. I'm going to go ahead and make another video on here. I know in the first video I said if you're good at something, never do it for free. Well, that's still not untrue, and I am creating some long form content that I want to put up on this channel. I'm presently working on it. Things like sort of long form, how I got my Thai citizenship, or how do we put it, sort of the timeline, the steps, the path, if you will, to Thai citizenship, and then anecdotal evidence, anecdotal information from me about how I went through it and all of that. That's going to be paid content, and I will be letting folks know as soon as I can regarding when that's going to become available, how soon, how much that's going to cost, all that good stuff. I'm also looking at doing some stuff like kind of a how-to course or guide. Hesitate to call it a course, but sort of a guide for new expats, folks coming to Thailand for the first time, things to be aware of, things to avoid, things to understand, all that good stuff. So stay tuned. I want to give some thanks to my friend Andrew Esquire for kind of broadening my horizons with respect to YouTube and kind of showing me that, yeah, I'm going to need to do a little bit of free content, if you will, on this particular channel, which I actually want to do. And that brings me to the topic at hand, calling this video Welcome to the Party Pals. And the quote, for those who are unaware, is from the great Die Hard movie, the Christmas classic Die Hard, when John McClane basically lets Al know, the cop throws that body down onto the car and says, welcome to the party, pal. Basically saying, you've been unaware of what's been going on. Now you're being jolted into awareness. Welcome to the party. And I thought of making this video because over the last week I've been really concerned. Well, I've been concerned about the issue of dollar reserve currency status for years. For those unaware, I'm kind of a gold bug at the end of the day. But what I really am is I'm an entrepreneur, and I really believe in entrepreneurialism. I think the best assets out there are functioning businesses, quite frankly, rather than sort of financialized assets. Or, I even have certain issues with sort of mainline equities, shares of stock and whatnot, because of the attenuation between the ownership and the ability to get the benefits, the cash flow in the forms of dividends from the underlying entity. It's always kind of made me a little nervous. Now, that's not to say I'm not, putting my money under a mattress. I have investments in equities and things of that nature, but I like to think of myself as sort of recognizing the fundamental issues associated with financialized assets, or more esoteric assets, rather than assets that you can quote unquote hold in your hand, or assets with no counterparty risk, for example. Leaving all that aside, my personal stuff aside, I've seen all over YouTube, and I'm going to put a smattering of links in the description below. I thought about sort of mentioning them all. I don't think that's going to do anybody any good, and I think it just makes this video unnecessarily long. But suffice it to say, there's a number of links in the video below, or in the description below, going to people that I've been listening to frequently. And let me be clear, I don't think any of these people are the end-all, be-all, but it's sort of a jigsaw puzzle. And in my mind, over the years, I've found that I have to read or listen to a great deal of content in order to pick out the small details to create the sort of distillate, if you will, of real knowledge, of real, hesitate to call it wisdom, because when it's happening sort of in real time, you can't really call it wisdom until you've had enough time to sort of tinker with it, kick it around, whatever the idea is or the notion is, to see if it really fundamentally comports with the way the world really works, or if it does actually provide some substantial insight. Setting that aside, what are we talking about in this video? Well, when I say welcome to Party Pals, this whole issue of the dollar is something that it seems to me, or I felt like some 10 years ago, when I would talk to people about it, I felt like I was banging my head against a wall to one degree or another. And it seems like within the past roughly 3 weeks, especially on YouTube, people have become hyper aware that there are issues which may be coming up with regard to the dollar. Now, some of that may be attributable to the fact that, yeah, major moves have happened in the last, really just in the last week. I think, and I've heard the quote from Lennon on YouTube especially like 1,000 times, it seems like at this point, over the course of many videos I've watched here recently, talking about how there's sometimes decades go by with nothing, where nothing happens, and then there's weeks that go by where decades happen. And I've heard that quote a lot lately, and yeah, there's a lot going on. Point of this video is, I'm not trying to be a doom and gloomer on the dollar per se, but I am a doom and gloomer compared to probably folks that are talking on television in the United States, for example, on, name any of the sort of investment related channels, CNBC, for example, or something. I'm not calling them out either. Just, any analog of CNBC out there that, any analogy to CNBC, and yes, there's been some talk about it, even in the mainstream back in the West, but now it seems like we have a lot of people that are getting very overwrought about the situation as it is, and they're not really seeing that the way it is. My point is, I think this is moving both acutely faster than many people are aware of, and I want to be clear on this, acutely slower than what the people that have cottoned on to this, what they, I think it's going to move slower than what they think it's going to move. What am I talking about? So, for example, I was just, this is not great. There's been all kinds of meetings between, for example, Putin and Xi Jinping. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is meeting with people and all this good stuff. Or not meeting with people, but they're having these meetings. The Saudis are talking about now, diversifying their sale of oil into other currencies, which effectively will mitigate and I think that's an understatement, but it will have a tremendous impact on the dollar because there's going to be less dollar usage in purchasing oil. That's just one example. This is a big deal. This is going to change a system which has effectively been in place for 50 odd years now, about 50 years. If you go back with the so-called petrodollar system, which was sort of a change from the prior Bretton Woods iteration, which had effectively ended in 1971, and then it took Kissinger a couple of years. I'm not going to go into all the detail here. I'm going to presume folks that are watching this are kind of aware of this. But yeah, Nixon takes the United States effectively off the gold standard, albeit temporarily, air quotes, and then within, I think it's 18 or 20 odd months, Kissinger has cut a deal with the Saudi Arabian Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that they will only sell oil in dollar-denominated tranches. Okay, this was a big, big deal at the time, and it basically set the stage for the last 50 years of relative peace and prosperity. Well, peace may be an overstatement, depending on how you look at the broader global situation, but definitely prosperity in terms of the United States, and stability for the dollar in terms of demand. A couple of things in the last couple of years, really since March of 2020, with the inception of the COVID lockdowns around the world, massive money printing as a result of that, stimulus checks, all of that fun stuff. Then at the same time, well, going back into February of 22 now, the United States effectively, well, they sanctioned Russia, which, in my opinion, is probably going to go down as a major, well, quite honestly, mistake in the long term, because it caused pretty much every country in the world to sort of look up and say, well, wow, if they can effectively strip the Russians of their ability to use their dollar reserves, where does that leave us? Not a great thing to have them thinking about if you want them to continue to just be happily using their dollars. So this has kind of led to what, in my opinion, is a bit of a hysteria now, especially on YouTube, of people saying the dollar is going to collapse, it's imminent, da 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 da. I'm not actually disagreeing with that per se, but what I do think is it's going to happen in a longer time frame than folks think it will. These things don't just sort of occur overnight, although what's the quote? I think it's often attributed to Ernest Hemingway, that how did you go bankrupt? Slowly, then all at once. There is something to be said for that. I think there may be a solution, although probably not one that the U.S. would love, because no matter how you cut this, long term, yeah, there's just going to be a diversification of currencies being used in international trade. As we've discussed, I did another video, sort of short form. I'm doing another video, sort of short form, on the fact that ASEAN has come out, and this is from the ASEANbriefing.com. Article is titled, ASEAN finance ministers and central banks consider dropping U.S. dollar, euro, and yen. Indonesia calls for phasing out Visa and MasterCard. Quoting directly, an official meeting of all ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors kicked off on Tuesday, March 28th in Indonesia. Top of the agenda are discussions to reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar, euro, yen, and British pound from financial transactions and move to settlements in local currencies. The meeting discussed efforts to reduce dependence on major currencies through the local currency transaction scheme. This is an extension of the previous local currency settlement scheme that has already begun to be implemented between ASEAN members. First thing to note there, this didn't happen yesterday. They've been working on this and sort of moving this through for months, if not years now. And I got to imagine this has been discussed. I mean, there's sort of a conceit in the commentariat, if you will, on YouTube or Rumble or wherever you're at, that central bankers sort of operate in a vacuum, that they don't know what's going on. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they're very well aware of the situation, although sometimes they perhaps like to seem either oblivious or might just be trying to turn a blind eye to situations they don't really want to acknowledge. Another quote worth noting here is, they say excuse me, I have a bit of a cold if I sound stuffed up. He is President Joko Widodo. He argued that Indonesia needed to shield itself from geopolitical disruptions, citing the sanctions targeting Russia's financial sector from the U.S., EU, and their allies. So, again, this is the world sort of perked up and said, whoa. You know, we could lose our ability to trade in the currency reserves that we built up at a moment's notice if we sort of just do something that the U.S. or the West, if you will, doesn't like. Yeah, we don't know that we necessarily want to be just fully committed to that. We may want to have some diversified interest in other currencies. Again, I think that's a reasonable presumption to make. This is where I think I differ a little bit from the herd, and that is, I have watched multiple situations play out over the last 15 years out here in Southeast Asia where, sort of for lack of a better term, the crowd becomes aware of something and then it's the biggest deal in the world. Oh my gosh, we got to run around. Our hair's on fire. We got to do this. We got to do that. Change everything, upend everything. That's not the way the world actually works. I think this is going to be more gradual than the people who cottoned onto it first think it will be, or in some instances, I kind of wonder if they want it to be. Again, I'm a gold bug myself. I don't want to see the collapse of the U.S. dollar where gold is priced in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for an ounce of gold. I don't, it just terrifies me for my fellow countrymen in the United States that they would have to live in that. That would be horrific to undergo that. Secondly, I think the rest of the world is well aware that if the dollar just collapses out, that creates a tremendous amount of instability where, we as in the United States become very, very rational, and irrationality can lead to volatile situations, which I don't think anybody really wants that. Meanwhile, the notion of counterparty, which always has to come up when discussing international finances, especially in an international, sort of country to country context. The old saying that if you owe the bank $100, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, the bank has a problem. The rest of the world vis-a-vis the United States is kind of in the latter part of that scenario where, the U.S. owes them tons and tons of money, ostensibly. Who has the problem there? Does the U.S., who already got the goods and services in exchange for the IOUs, or did the rest of the world have the issue? That's part of it. Also, again, I think there's going to be a desire in the international community to try and mitigate down as much as possible any sort of geopolitical volatility as a result of problems emanating from the dollar. Now, that said, we're going to have to come to by we, I mean Americans, are going to have to come to some realizations that, the world is changing. Asia is on the rise, especially Eurasia. I mean, we're talking about hyper-industrialization, effectively. And this hyper-industrialization in Eurasia, that's going to happen whether or not the West cares about it, does anything about it, whatever. It's going to occur. So, worrying about that or trying to have some sort of response to that, I don't know that there's even a point in responding to it. It just is. It's going to happen. I mean, here in Thailand, you can just see, and Thailand was already a pretty industrialized country. It had some heavy and light industry. It's just going gangbusters here at the minute. I mean, it's like nothing I've ever seen. And I was in awe of Thailand 12, 13 years ago when I was kind of my eyes were open to the fact that, Thailand's got a pretty good size economy. I mean, it's kind of one of my pet peeves among expats where they go on and on about, well, if the Thais don't take care of the expats, if they don't take care of tourism, it's just going to be dire for Thailand. Yeah, it's not good. We saw it during COVID that when they shut it down, it's like 20% of GDP, but it's only 20% of GDP. It's not all of GDP. This isn't like a Caribbean nation where all of the foreign exchange comes from tourism, for example. So where do I think things should go from here? I think we Americans, the American in me believes, and full disclosure, those who are unaware, I'm Thai American. I naturalized to Thai 5 years ago, but America is still the old country. I love America. Where does that leave things? America needs to get realistic, real fast. Look at some of these links. There's one in there from Sam Zell, I believe at 831 in that link. He basically says the same thing. It's, we have to recognize that we can't do, he's talking in the specific context of some of this sustainability, green energy, all of these, in my opinion, they're not pie in the sky, but they're things that politicians are talking about as if they can happen a week from now, and it's going to take a couple of decades from now for them to occur. So on the one hand, as he points out, we need to get very realistic. At the same time, realism is not fully buying into this whole hysteria that, everything's going to collapse tomorrow. If we do nothing, we being the United States, if Americans do nothing, then yes, over the coming months and years, and not that far off, I don't think. As noted by a guy I really listen to a lot, Alistair McLeod, who I think fully understands this situation probably better than I do. But from his language, you think it's going to happen. You know, not. I infer from things that he says that, oh, this could happen imminently, like it's going to happen sooner than a lot of people think. I think that's absolutely true, but I think there's certain people that watch that and think that that means like tomorrow. I don't think that's the case. I think there's some time. There's going to be some lag between this stuff coming down the pike and then the actual practical ramifications. My point being, during that lag, the United States, and quite honestly the rest of the world, and I think it is good for everybody, needs to probably have a sit-down, needs to have a meeting, a sit-down, sort of to... Michael Franzese, who's over on YouTube, is out there on YouTube as well. He always uses that term sit-down because he's like a New York wise guy or whatever. And yeah, the world needs to have one of those. And for those who are unaware, we've done this before. There was what was called the Plaza Accord in 1985 and the Louvre Accord in 1987. Jim Rickards brought that to my attention through a couple of his books, as well as when he's been on YouTube. He's talked about that, Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord. Similar circumstances. The yen and the Japanese economy were disrupting, I guess is lack of that word, the world order or the global economic order of that day. And as a result, they had to have a sit down to sort of hash out how to make everything work, how to keep everything harmonious, for lack of a better term. Whether or not there's a will to do this in any capital in the world, I don't know. But I do think there is a way, sort of, to quote Tom Hanks in the movie Charlie Wilson's War, where he says, there's a couple of ways out of this where everybody lives, so to speak. I think there's a way that this could be brought to a conclusion where, yes, over the course of the next decades, yeah, the dollar is going to lose its dominance as the single or exclusive reserve currency. And let's be clear what's happening here. There are other reserve currencies other than the dollar, as pointed out in that ASEAN briefing. There's the yen, there's the pound, there's the euro. But we're going to see more now. The yuan is going to pop up. Now, as Mr. Chappell notes in his China Uncensored piece that I'll link to in the description, presently, thinking that the yuan is just going to immediately take over for the dollar is nonsensical. It's not freely tradable in the same way the dollar is. It's very much a controlled currency. Chinese have no desire to change that. So in the sense that it's a reserve currency on par with the dollar, I don't think that's true. It also, I believe, again, I'm just thinking of him off the top of my head, but I'll put the link to that video in there. I believe he said presently the yuan only accounts for 2% of global trade transactions. It's very small. Now, it's a big deal that Russia has now come in and said, we're going to hook up with China and use the yuan to that purpose for purposes of trade and energy and all of this good stuff. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. It's one I don't think the West fully cottons onto, fully comprehends just how big a deal that is. But there's a lag here. There's a minute. And I think there is an opportunity, and it may be going on behind the scenes. I'd love to know that that's the case. That may be wishful thinking. Where everybody maybe sits down and says, hey, do we really want to see calamity in terms of the global economy by just sort of all sticking our heads in the sand and pretending this isn't happening? And by all of us, I mean the U.S. pretending the dollar is not losing or the dollar's position is not reorienting against other currencies by just failing to recognize that. And also by everyone else failing to recognize that, if you just let the dollar just collapse into nothing, there's huge ramifications in terms of global geopolitical volatility that arises out of that scenario. And that's not good for anybody either. So, the way to sort of cut the baby in half, so to speak, or cut the Gordian knot, it's probably for everybody to just sit down and come to some kind of an arrangement whereby over time, the realities are better reflected in the media, if you will, mediums of exchange in currencies for goods and services throughout the world. I don't know exactly how this plays out. The one insight I think I have that all these other giants out there are not really seeing is that, yes, the dollar is going to reorient relative to other currencies internationally. This is going to happen. I think there are people that see that. I think there are people that don't see that too. And there's a ton of people that are insightful to provide insight to the people that don't see it. What the people that see it are failing to maybe take into consideration is there's a lag from the initial triggering events that transpire to the dire consequences that could be incurred as a result of these events being triggered. There's a lag time between those two things. And during that lag time, the world has an opportunity to get together and come up with a framework, if nothing else, to deal with this, mitigate this as best as possible, while at the same time taking on board the reality that Eurasian integration is resulting in, for one example, massive industrialization and will result in further industrialization. There are more than just China out there in terms of rising industrial powers. China is just one example. I don't even view Russia as, I think Russia will this is all just kind of a lateral move for them, frankly, in my mind. They're going to continue to be a major resource producer, but, their population, their demographics are not such that I see them becoming sort of an industrial powerhouse. Meanwhile, down here in Southeast Asia, there's nowhere to go but up in some of these countries. Look at the wild growth in Vietnam, for example. Here in Thailand, okay, Thailand's a bit of a more, I don't know how to put it, Thailand's already been in the game. Thailand's not starting from zero. Thailand's a relatively sophisticated economy. My friend Andrew calls them developing. I would say developed, but with tons of room to grow, obviously, and will continue to grow economically. Malaysia's another one. Indonesia has the opportunity to be a powerhouse. The stage is set there to just massive economic growth over time. Not just resources. We're talking tons of people. The service sector could go nuts. There's nothing but optimism economically down here in Southeast Asia, quite honestly, no matter what the rest of the world does at this point. I think that die has been cast. ASEAN is on the rise. There's no doubt about that. But the thing that worries me is that insouciance, or maybe complacency is the right word, in the West is resulting in not seeing what's really happening in terms of the economy and in terms of the future of the dollar. And then simultaneously, the people that do get it, in their sort of hyperbole that, I hesitate to say the sky is falling. They're not saying that. These are very smart people. But I think something they're not seeing is they're so focused on this big deal that, this is like really a world-changing event we're going through, this transition, and this is happening. They're failing to see that there is a lag, and that lag creates the opportunity for the major currency powers, if you want to call it, of the world to sit down, again, akin to the Plaza Accord, akin to the Louvre Accord, to come up with a framework whereby we can have some relative harmony globally with regard to currency policies, monetary policies, that will perhaps not fully stem the tide, but at least mitigate some of the worst practical implications of these changes on the populations of the world, both in the West as well as in other countries. There's counterparties here. If Western demand collapses for Chinese goods, that's not good for China. Now, I'm not one of these people that believes that that will destroy China. No, it won't. They have other trading partners, but it ain't going to be good for them either. They're not going to love that. And other countries are going to feel the same way. So, long story short, there's some nuance here that I don't think a lot of folks are seeing. And for what it's worth, I'm just one guy, and I'm just going to throw this out here on YouTube. And if folks listen to it, if they massively disagree with me, no problem. But I do think, I'm sitting here on Sunday, April 9th, 9 a.m. Bangkok time. That's just my observation. People may see it for what it is. They may completely disagree with me, but I think the world has an opportunity to stave off calamity if we can all just kind of cooperate, even if we don't really love cooperating with each other right now, because we're all kind of have some animosity toward each other. If we can just kind of cooperate, let some cooler heads prevail, and let's just come up with a framework so we can all get down the road, make a living, and do what's, everybody can just kind of try to do what's best for their own citizenry. So my 2 cents on that, for what it's worth. And so anybody out there, yeah, by the way, yes, I do wear glasses, if anybody brings that up. I don't in the main channel videos. But yeah, I do wear glasses, so you may see me in glasses, especially in videos that I do on the weekends, which I suspect I'll be doing, especially the free ones for this channel. I suspect I'll be doing them on the weekends because I obviously don't want to impede on any of the time that I need to be expending within the firm. So hope those who watched this video found it enjoyable or at least somewhat enlightening. It's sort of for what it's worth, just my 2 cents, one man's opinion. I'll put links in the description below to stuff that I thought was pertinent and interesting with regard to all of this. And I hope everybody has a good one.